tell the truth.
Welcome to The Truth Hurts. This is your host, Sule Prince. Sule Prince.
Johnny, that really hurt.
Whether you like it or not, sometimes the truth hurts. The truth hurts. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Will set you free.
Today, I have a very special guest with me today, Dale Glover, and we are going to discuss a very interesting topic. We are going to discuss the Shroud of Turin. Now, many of you probably don't know this topic. You probably have heard of it, but never researched it deeply, or you may never have heard of the topic at all whatsoever. Well, we have Dale here to help us understand this topic and why it is important. So, Dale, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on, Sule. The Shroud of Turin is a topic that's important to me. It had a role as one of the evidences that brought me to faith in Christ. And like you said, not a lot of Christians know much about it. So I think it's crucial to understand that we have this another set of evidence for the resurrection.
Amen. Good thought. Now, let me ask you this question before we actually jump into this topic. What research did you do on this topic, and what were the scholars that helped you come to the position that you're holding today?
Yeah, so on this topic, so I did tons of research. So I was first introduced to the Shroud by my friend, Dr. Gary Habermas. He's kind of known for arguing for the Shroud of Turin as a famous Christian apologist there. And before that, I kind of just dismissed the Shroud as a Roman Catholic relic, and that's not for me. I'm a proper Bible believing Protestant, So, but once I saw that Gary was taking it seriously, I kind of watched everything he said about the Shroud and read some of his papers on the Shroud, and I was really impressed with the scientific evidence, and that's what caught my eye. Is like, wow, this is credible science, in peer-reviewed papers and that sort of thing. And there's a legitimate argument for a miracle. So from there, that's where I dived in deep into the research of the scientific evidence for the images. At one point, Gary Habermas hooked me up with Shroud expert Barry Schwartz, who's Jewish. He's not a Christian, but he was involved in a scientific team studying the Shroud back in 1978. And he believes, because of the evidence, that the Shroud was authentic. And, he was kind of the key guy. He had all the connections with all the scientists. He knew all the papers and stuff like that. So it was through him that I was given direct access to the primary witnesses, the primary sources. And I was just impressed. In the end, I came to the conclusion this thing is a miraculous image.
Oh, okay. That sounds very interesting. So let's jump right in.
Sure.
Let's ask a deep question, because a lot of people, when they would view the Shroud, if they heard anything about it, they kind of connected to when the Roman Catholics have these phenomenons where a statue is crying blood. And this is some proof of their belief system. The Shroud kind of fit into that category to many people. But to you, you're saying it's deeper and it is what they actually say it is.
Yeah, because the quality of the evidence is absolutely different. So I've actually studied a little bit into the Eucharistic miracles or these Marian apparitions. My friend Caleb Jackson is actually writing a scholarly level book. It's a 2-volume book on this and stuff, and he's presented on other podcasts. And there's no comparison kind of thing. These things, first of all, they're not published in peer-reviewed science journals, whereas with the Shroud of Turin, the research on that front in things like applied optics or the Canadian Sciences of Forensic journal and that sort of thing. So these things are in the most famous secular science journals in the world, and that just makes it qualitatively different. I would say
Great explanation. Okay, so tell me, what's the Shroud? What's the Shroud of Turin, and why do you think it's important for us to know about it?
Absolutely. So the Shroud of Turin is a long linen cloth. It's about 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide. And essentially, and it has images of both the front side of a man and the backside of a man.
Okay.
And it has various injuries throughout it, various whip-like scourge wounds throughout. There are blood stains, what look to be like nail wounds in the hand, the wrists, and the feet, with blood flows flowing out of those. And there's also a crown of thorns around the shroud man's head, or wounds that are consistent with the crown of thorns. So obviously, on the pro shroud side, people are saying, well, this is authentically Jesus's burial shroud. And it looks like these images got on the cloth during the resurrection through a miracle of God. Now, shroud skeptics, on the other hand, will say, no, this is just a medieval artwork of some kind that, is depicting Jesus. So that's what the shroud is. Now, why is it important? Well, quite obviously, if the pro shroud side is correct, if it did cover the historical Jesus and there are miraculous images on there, number one, it has immense historical and sentimental value. We have the burial cloth Jesus was wrapped in as he died for our sins. And secondly, we have proof of a divine miracle associated with Jesus' death and resurrection, which will help to convert unbelievers, just as it did me, and to strengthen the faith of Christians already who may have doubts.
Okay. So, Dale, why do you think when we have these arguments for the historical Jesus and the resurrection, and the different arguments they use to show that the resurrection was a historical event that Christians should hold to, why is the shroud never one of those arguments to show that the resurrection is true?
So in a historical context, so I would say sometimes it is. So for example, Gary Habermas, he just published his scholarly volume 1 of his scholarly level book on the historical evidence for the resurrection. And he does contain a little blurb about the Shroud of Turin from a historical perspective. But you are correct that, I've never seen the shroud mentioned by William Lane Craig or, Craig Keener or Mike Lacona even, right? So there's a hesitancy. And I think that's because there's a social stigma surrounding the shroud. Most people have never heard of it. And those who have only see it through the lens of the skeptics. They just assume it's a medieval fake or a Roman Catholic relic. And so people that come across and say, well, no, actually, I'm on the pro shroud side. I think it's authentic. We're kind of seen falsely as kooks, as not being credible. But of course, people that think that way, they know nothing about the scholarship that's actually available for it. So I think that's why, most biblical scholars, when they're making a case from the history, they know nothing about really the scientific evidence for the shroud.
Okay. So you're basically saying that this is a topic that we should jump on and grasp to be able to demonstrate the proof of the resurrection and the historicity of Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, why on earth would you not want more evidence? I love, the minimal facts type approach to proving that the resurrection happened historically. Why not, have scientific evidence supporting that additionally proves the same thing? The more the merrier when it comes to evidence.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this topic is difficult for many to promote because there's a lot of science involved in it as well. So you have to have like a sense of a scientific background to be able to show some of the arguments for the shroud. Would you agree?
I think so, yeah. So definitely, if you're arguing for a miracle, there is a lot of science involved, and there's just no way around that. Now, I will say this though, that the science of the shroud has been around for decades now, since 1978 at least, and some people are better communicators than others, and so Barry Schwartz, I mentioned him, or someone like Joe Marino. These guys are great popularizers. I wish I had their gift. Or same with Gary Habermas. So many people have said like, wow, when Gary presents this on the shroud, like it all makes sense. He does a great job and stuff like that. So I wish I had their gift for being as good of a popular level speaker and stuff. But yeah, I think there is a way to convey the essential scientific case without getting into all the details for people that are new to it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So now you've invented the minimal relevant features approach and use this to study the shroud. So can you explain what that means? What is this approach?
Absolutely. So this kind of refers to my methodology to studying the shroud evidence. So that I came up with this as an unbeliever, as a non-Christian, right? When I was studying the shroud, and I wanted a systematic way to approach the evidence for the shroud. And so I came up with this thing called the minimal relevant features approach. It's very similar to, on the historical side, the minimal facts approach of Gary Habermas, right? So essentially, my minimal relevant features approach is I only use the minimal number of properties proven scientifically about the shroud. So, there are physical properties, and I'll talk more about those later. And there are certain chemical properties that have been scientifically proven about the shroud images. I only use the minimal amount necessary to prove that there's a miracle, but I have two criteria for the facts that I use. So the first is that some pro-shroud experts will label it as type A, type B, and type C level facts, or class 1, class 2. I only use type A or class 1 level facts. These are facts that are at least 2/3 of all the scholars accept as being a fact, and that are extremely highly evidenced in the secular peer-reviewed science literature as to be almost evidentially unquestionable. So that's the minimal set of facts that I use to establish my case. There are other facts that are, have been proven scientifically, but they're a little more controversial, or or maybe they haven't even been published in a peer-reviewed journal. I just leave those out. So that's what I mean by the minimal relevant features. It's basically the selection of facts that I use. I only use the uncontroversial ones.
Okay, and you believe that those selection of facts are good enough to prove the shroud?
Yep, it's sufficient to prove a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
That's.
So when do you think you would use the controversial ones, and why would you use those?
Yeah, so if you include the controversial ones, it can strengthen the case for a miracle. This might be an upcoming question, but I'll just give an quick example here now. So, like, an example of a fact that speaks to whether it's a miracle or not that Gary Habermas uses is, for example, that there are visible bones and teeth on the shroud man's body images. And Gary is consulted with various dentists who've confirmed this from the images. And I myself, I admit, I can see these on close-up images I've gotten from Barry Schwartz from STIR. So I see what they're talking about there. Now, if there's bones and teeth on the shroud, that points to the fact that whatever form the images happened from within the body. It wasn't just on the surface of the body kind of thing, right? So that speaks towards image formation. What on earth would come from within the body that would encode bones and teeth on the shroud? The problem with the reason I don't use that fact is you're not going to find that in a peer-reviewed journal. STIR, and it's very controversial, right? So not all shroud experts admit this is a fact.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So what would you say are some of the characteristics of the shroud image that really makes it remarkable, that we have to say that, okay, this is just not a graphic that somebody put on this cloth or a painting? What about the shroud would you say that, no, this is remarkable, this is something that the world needs to hear about?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there are several features that have been found. So the first one, going back to 1898, is when a guy named Secondo Pia took the first picture of the shroud. He realized when he went to his darkroom later on to develop the photographic plates, he saw the photo negative image, and he realized that with the shroud, things are reversed. So the images that we see with the naked eye is actually the photo negative. When you bring it into on the plates in the darkroom, that's the photo positive. That's the way the image ought to be. So it's different than our photos. It's reversed kind of thing. And that's a remarkable feature, right? Because no medieval artist could, paint that on purpose or even conceive of the idea of doing that on purpose. So I think the photo negativity, those black and white photos are incredible, where the lights and darks of the images are reversed. Secondly, in 1976, a bunch of scientists were using what's called a VP8 image analyzer, and they discovered that the shroud's images contain three-dimensional information. They encode accurately the depth information or the topographical information. So what that means in a nutshell is that the lights and darknesses of the images reflect the distance between the body and the cloth. So that the tip of the nose is darker because it was closer to the cloth than the cheek, and that sort of thing. So that's an incredible feature. Another one is there's body image superficiality. So the color of the images is only on the outer surface of the cloth. So it's only on the top 2 to 3 fibers of every single thread. Each thread has about 200 fibers or something like that. And on each fiber, it's only on the primary cell wall, that, zero point 0.2 micrometers of the surface of a fiber. And bear in mind, a fiber has a diameter lesser than that of a human hair. So this is incredibly small.
So why is that significant? Why?
Yeah.
Well, what should we garner from that?
So basically the color is superficial. It didn't involve a mechanism that would penetrate through the diameter of a human hair. It would just hit the surface and then stop. It wouldn't go through or soak down into the cloth or penetrate through the cloth.
Okay.
And that is relevant for, well, how are these images formed type deal. I think those are some of the main things. And I mentioned, the bones and teeth is a feature, but like I said, it's controversial. Yeah.
Okay. So that there's always skeptics.
Right.
When it comes to topics such as these. And some skeptics will actually claim that the shroud is just a medieval artwork of some kind. Is there any truth to that?
So I would say absolutely no. There's no truth to it being a medieval artwork. And in fact, a team called STIRP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, back in 1978, a team of secular scientists, Christians, non-Christians, they were experts, and they were tasked to go over to Turin and study the shroud in person with dozens of spectral instruments. For a period of 5 days, taking photographs at various wavelengths, taking micro photographs, as well as removing hundreds of samples from the shroud to test specifically, is this thing a painting? Is it just some medieval artwork? And they tested for various theories. They tested for painting, powder rubbing, a scorch hypothesis, and the shroud as being a protophoto, what Nicholas Allen calls a protophoto technique. And they ended up falsifying every single one of these theories. It was deemed scientifically impossible for these artistic theories to explain the shroud images.
Okay, but couldn't the shroud have been formed naturally by the body being wrapped in the cloth? And if you disagree with it, then how did the images form?
Okay, so obviously, if it isn't some kind of medieval artwork along the lines that the shroud skeptics like to say, the next option is saying, okay, well, maybe it covered a real body. And a lot of people in the natural category will even admit, yeah, and it covered Jesus specifically. But couldn't the images be formed naturally, just involving a human body being covered in a corpse, right? Maybe direct contact. We know our sweat and stuff like that can leave stains on cloths. So maybe there is some kind of direct contact between the body and the cloth, or some kind of gases during decomposition emitted from the body and created those images. Now, subsequent to STIRP, there have been various scientific experiments done to test whether this would work. These include lab and field experiments. So Eugenia Natowski conducted field experiments on this in Jerusalem itself, in the same environment and stuff, and they've all failed. They know they don't come anywhere close to replicating the shroud images in total with all of their minimal relevant features type deal. So yeah, maybe you can get an image, but it's not a superficial one, or it doesn't contain the three-dimensional information. So those all fail. So that's why most scientists who've studied the shroud images have been forced to kind of, question, well, could there be a supernatural explanation? Maybe some kind of, what most scientists think is that some kind of radiation must have emitted from the body and created those images. And there have been scientific experiments from 1990 onwards testing different forms of radiation, and they do actually reproduce images very similar to the shroud with its properties.
So would that be a theory that you'd hold? Some radiation came from the body of Jesus and put this image on the shroud?
Yes. So there are different types of radiation theories that have been proposed. I think the one that's best proposed to date is by a nuclear engineer named Bob Rucker, who's a friend of mine. His is called the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. So at the moment of Jesus' resurrection, a burst of radiation emanated from the body. No, for him, the type of radiation was charged particles. So specifically protons is what was responsible for creating the images, because those wouldn't penetrate the cloth. They would just create superficial coloring and stuff like that on the image fibers. It would reflect the three-dimensional data and all of that. But there is also neutron irradiation, which is going to be relevant to the dating of the shroud, and we'll get to that in a future question. But so I think the charged particles radiation burst is the best hypothesis. And the reason I favor it is because with Bob Rucker, a lot of times on the pro-shroud side, when they're coming up with their radiation hypothesis, they'll work from the top down. They'll say, well, okay, so this is my theory. And okay, how can I make it fit the evidence? So they kind of tweak their experiments, or for ultraviolet radiation, they'll kind of tweak how long do I give the burst for to make it superficial. Bob Rucker's working in the opposite way, bottom up. He's saying, what are the facts? And then how do I explain these facts? What mechanism could explain all of this? So that's why I favor his hypothesis. And even skeptics have no response to his hypothesis and its incredible predictions that it makes, that it's easily testable and falsifiable. So I think it's by far the best.
So would you say that when Jesus was coming back into his body, there would have been this burst of radiation? Is that what you're saying? And that it would have forced his image on that cloth?
Yep, exactly. At that moment of the resurrection, Bob Rucker's calculated it would be the supernatural event. The moment of the resurrection lasted 1 femtosecond. Mm-hmm. That's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second. So, that was when that burst happened and emitted the images onto that cloth.
Now, that would have been interesting to see. Jesus coming back into the body and what would have happened.
But that's what the shroud is. It's literally a supernatural photograph of what Jesus was like at the moment of his resurrection. That's what it claims to be. So we've got that.
That is amazing. That I have some questions about that I'll ask you later. Sure. But what about the dating of the shroud? Doesn't it date to the medieval period around the 14th century? And is that a concern for us that the dating is so late?
So absolutely, it can be a concern, right? Because if we're claiming it covered Jesus historically, and we find out it's it dates to the medieval period, well, those don't match. Jesus lived in 30 AD, not in the medieval time. So there is a problem for a lot of people. Now, if you do you mind if I answer before I get into my answer on the carbon dating? Can I add something that's not on the list there that might
go
be
ahead,
interesting?
sure. Yeah.
Okay, so don't blame pro shroud people for this. This is my unique idea. So I'm the idiot if this sounds dumb, but I actually believe I argue that the dating of the shroud is totally irrelevant with respect to the question. So pretend it is medieval. I don't care. That's great. I can still prove those images were formed miraculously. And since they depict Jesus and represent his death and resurrection, we still have a miracle attesting to those events, even if it dates to the medieval period. That's something that a lot of people don't go for. But if you think about it, why couldn't God perform a miracle authenticating Christianity and create miraculous images at any period in human history?
That's right.
There's nothing implausible. I mean, some people, I don't know if you're a cessationist on your end, but some people see no issue with God doing miraculous healings and that sort of thing today, or that sort of thing. So I don't think there's anything implausible, at least about saying, well, maybe God did create a medieval miracle, miraculous image kind of thing.
So
Now,
are you saying God created a miraculous image that lasted to this medieval period?
so no, what I'd be saying is that let's in the medieval period,
Mhm.
God poof created these images for one reason or another. He created these miraculous images on this linen cloth. Um, so I get that's totally ad hoc and that sort of thing, but I'm just saying, even if, right, even if a worst case scenario we do prove the shroud's medieval, that does not the scientific evidence that these are miraculous images is exactly the same. Okay, so let me put that controversial idea to the side.
Well, hold on. Before
Sure,
you get into since
go.
you're getting controversial there, I can see a person asked a question. What would be the point of God making this image appear so many years later instead of from that distinct point in time?
So we can only speculate as to God's motivations, but obviously we know God is omniscient, and in his providence, he does a whole bunch of things throughout history for reasons that we don't fully comprehend in the moment. So, but one reason would be to provide miraculous evidence of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that God would know would be studied in the 20th century and lead me in part to faith. And maybe these images were needed in the medieval period for that same purpose, because we know that a lot of people did come to faith through seeing the shroud exhibited in the Leary Chapel and stuff like that. So, again,
That's
my
your
answer is
theory.
just
Yeah,
sorry.
that's your idea.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's my idea. No, nobody else argues for this kind of thing. So let's put that to the side. I only submit that as a worst case scenario. What do the actual facts say? And here's the good news: the shroud isn't medieval. It does date to the first century to Jesus. So we don't even need to worry about that kind of speculation. But there is carbon dating that happened in 1988, and unfortunately, that did date the shroud to the medieval period. Now, the issue with that is that we found out afterwards that the carbon dating was done unreliably. You can't, it proves nothing, literally nothing, because what happened is the carbon 14 scientists at the time, first of all, they only dated one sample location. That's not good enough, right? Because there could be contamination in that area. There could be something going on with that area of the cloth.
Yeah.
And that's why you need to test different areas of the shroud to prevent that. Secondly, we know that they eliminated the outliers in their dates. So they got about 16. Oh, sorry. They got about,
Yeah.
all right. They got 16 subsample results, because when they get their samples, they cut it up into smaller pieces for the testings. So they got 16 dates, but they only reported 12 of them at the time. Well, what happened to the other four? Why did they eliminate those? Oh, because those were outside the range within the medieval period that they needed to get. Meaning it was dating, in one case, it dated younger to the 1400s. Another one was earlier than the medieval thing. And so they just eliminated that and said, oh, we'll just pretend those didn't happen. We'll just assume those are random measurement errors. But statisticians have studied that and proven those are not random measurement errors. They're actually indicative of a systematic bias. There's something systematically creating an error in the results they got. Something's affecting those carbon dates.
Okay.
Now, what that is, scientifically, we don't know. But what a good hypothesis is what I was talking about with Bob Rucker, because remember, if particle radiation formed the images with protons, we know that that would also emit neutrons, and neutrons affect carbon-14 dates. And it just coincidentally, when he calculated this out, he proved that if the shroud was from 30 AD and got neutron irradiated at the time of Jesus' resurrection, we would precisely get the exact dates and the range of dates and the slope of dates that we obtained from the carbon-14 dating. So it all matches and checks out. One last thing I'll say on the carbon dating, this will be new for you, but I think it'll be interesting. So in 1973, believe it or not, 1988 is not the only time the shroud was carbon dated.
Okay.
In 1973, they removed a sample from the same area, around the same area, called the Reyes sample. Now they carbon dated that part of the shroud, and guess what they got? 1st century AD, the
Wow.
time of Jesus.
Wow.
Now that carbon-14 dating process was also flawed, and that's why nobody mentions it and stuff like that. There was problems with the procedure there, but if you're going to take one flawed carbon-14 dates, then I'll just pick the one that dates to the 1st century then. So, yeah.
That is good. Let me ask you a question. When it comes to this image, why do we want to assume that the image is Jesus and not somebody else?
That's a great question. So I think it's clear from the contextual indicators. And first, let me say this. Look, everyone with half a functioning brain, even shroud skeptics, sometimes you wonder about atheists, but or some of them, but even they will admit this is clearly Jesus. Even if you think it's an artwork, it's a picture of who? Of Jesus, right?
Okay.
So nobody actually denies that this is of Jesus. Maybe you'll get Matt Dillahunty, but who cares about that guy? And you can tell, look, from the wounds himself, you can tell he's got all of these scourges that look like they're consistent with a Roman flagrum weapon. You've got a spear wound in the side with blood and a clear liquid or flowing out, just like the Gospel of John describes for Jesus. He's crucified, and the nail wounds are in the 1st century accurate location. So the nails are coming out of the wrist, not the palms of the hands, which is what medieval people always depicted Jesus' crucifixion as. And then you have the crown of thorns. And clearly you can tell from anatomically, this is a Jewish man of Semitic descent and stuff like that. So put the pieces together. Who does that sound like? So we have someone who matches the description of Jesus's death as described in the Gospels and his pre-death treatment. But here's something else. How does it imply the resurrection? So it's not just the death, but the resurrection's proven because we see evidence. And my friend Teddy Pappas just published a paper on this where she references a 150-year meta-study on rigor mortis.
Okay.
And she proves meticulously that man in the shroud is still in rigor mortis.
Wow.
And and there's no signs of a buildup of decomposition liquids or putrefaction on the shroud. What does that mean? Somehow that body was removed from the cloth before he lost rigor mortis, before he decomposed to the point where there would be the liquids and stuff like that, and somehow left miraculous images within a matter of days. And within the Jerusalem area, if it was in there, it would have to be within 3 days or so, right? Who does that sound like?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like Jesus' death and resurrection. So, yeah.
And so all these images you're saying is on the shroud, the scourging, the spear, the nails in the wrist and in the feet. That's all there.
Yep, it's all there. And there's something like 130 scourge wounds on the frontal image alone and like over 200 on the back
Wow.
that have all been identified. But guess what? Only you can't see that with the naked eye. It's only identifiable on the photographic negative images. Why, if a medieval artist, why would he paint invisible wounds that you
Yeah.
can't see with your eyes? Yeah.
That's a good argument. Yeah, that's a good argument. So what about the Darcy Memorandum? Didn't some medieval bishops inquiry prove that the shroud was painted by an artist in the year 1350?
He did not prove. So I would say actually the opposite. So the Darcy Memorandum here, this is something that'll be new for you, Sule, but and I'll talk about this in my part 2 Bible study. But so Bishop Darcy, he was a bishop living in Troyes in France around 1389. And he allegedly wrote a memo to the Pope complaining about the church in Leary showing the shroud and making money off of it to pilgrims, right? And he was saying, it's all about greed. It's a fake and all this stuff. And as proof that it's a fake, my predecessor, the guy who was the bishop before me, a guy named Bishop Henry de Portier, held an official inquiry. And at that inquiry, the artist or an artist came up and confessed that the shroud images were painted. So that's what the memo itself is. And shroud skeptics appeal to this as kind of damning evidence. See, that's proof it's medieval. It came into existence in France in the 1350s. Now, here's the problem. So there's several problems. Just analyzing this as a historical document. Secular historians don't accept this as an authentic document. First of all, we have several other documents from the Pope, the King, and including a letter from Bishop Henry himself. They're all signed and dated. This is not signed and dated as the official stamp is. So people don't think this was even ever sent in the first place. Our earliest manuscripts of this alleged memo come from the 1800s. We have no mention of this memo in any of the external documents from the period or from historians cataloging the period afterwards. Even more importantly, what about the contents of the memo? There's no official records in any of the letters we have, all of them signed and dated from the Pope, from the King of France, everyone involved in this controversy. There's no mention of an inquiry at all. There's no mention of the shroud being a fake at all and stuff like that. The only thing we have from the time is Bishop Henry, right? So the Darcy, the guy he was talking about, and it was written 3 months before he died. Mm-hmm. And at the end of his life, what is he writes a letter to the Leary Church. And what is he saying? Is he saying, you fraudulent people, you're showing a fake shroud? No. He says, I approve and ratify of everything you guys are doing with your divine cult at that church. So this directly contradicts what this Bishop Darcy guy said. So it's complete bunk. And, just for some irony, one of the letters we do have is from the Pope telling this Bishop Darcy guy to shut his mouth or he'll be excommunicated forever. So, yeah, it's not good evidence.
Okay, that's good. Let's get into some characteristics. The person where the image on the shroud, which we believe is Jesus, what was the height of this individual?
So we don't know precisely because we don't know about the treatment of the cloth. There may be stretching, and there definitely is some stretching and stuff. But the best estimates that we have is he's about 5'9". So that's trying to take into account some stretching and stuff like that. So plus or minus 1 or 2 inches.
Okay. Now, in our personal conversation, you had stated that the artworks that you see in history of Jesus were based on the image made on the shroud. That's correct?
Yep, that's one. Yep, that's exactly one of the arguments. Yep.
Okay, so people would have issue because when you see the person on the shroud, he apparently has long hair, and he looks like he's Caucasian. Is there any concern with that?
So in terms of the long hair, there's zero concern at all because that is it's false to say that that's a medieval conception. People in the ancient Jews in the first century did have long hair, quote unquote, long hair. But by long hair, that means shoulder length. That was considered short back then. That wasn't an issue for Jewish people in the first century, as all biblical scholars will attest. And I've even found archaeological depictions of Jews with shoulder length hair. So yeah, so the long hair is not an issue at all. That's absolutely indicative of a first century Jew. It's also consistent with the medieval kind. Now, in terms of him being did you want to follow up on that? Or?
Yeah. With the hair. So you had explained, so I want you to tell our audience when Paul talks about it is shameful for a man to have long hair. And then now we are seeing in history that the Jews potentially had long hair. How do we reconcile that difference?
Yeah, so Paul in First Corinthians, Paul kind of says, like, doesn't nature tell us it's a shame for a man to have long hair? So in the first place, the key there is, well, what do you mean by long, right? You can't use a 1950s definition of long hair to define what was short versus long in the first century. But more importantly, that the word that Paul uses, the Greek word that he's using there, he's obviously talking about hairstyles, not even necessarily the length of hair there. So the issue was that, men and women, he wanted to prevent them from dressing up like women or wearing their hair like the other sex. No, you're clearly a man. This is what's appropriate for men to have in this culture. This is what's appropriate for women and stuff like that. You're to conform to those standards. He's totally against transgenders and stuff. Mm-hmm. The other thing you mentioned is about he looks like a white guy, a white man. So absolutely he doesn't. I'm always confused by this because I've never seen it kind of thing, right? Personally. So he doesn't look white at all. But the ethnologists who've actually studied him, I think a guy named Dr. Carlton Coons and stuff, I've quoted him. And everyone who studies the man, it's perfect. He's consistent with modern day Shepherdic Jews as well as ancient Jews of a Shepherdic variety. So he fits in within the Semitic race. And this isn't just human beings who studied this. There's been a computerized anthropometric study that's been done that also shows Jesus to be consistent with those of a Semitic race. He's not Caucasian in any way. So, yeah.
I used to go to New York when I was in my teen years. I used to go there a lot. And we would have these groups of they're Black nationalists and Black religion, the Nation of Islam, the Nation of God on Earth. You'd have the Black Hebrew Israelites. And these groups disdain white people. And one thing that they would always shout is your blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus that you guys worship. Yeah. So in our conversation that we had together, which was a shock to me, is that you're saying there were people in the time of Jesus that could potentially have had blonde hair.
Yeah, or I think light brown hair and stuff like that. So it was a mixed. Remember, we're talking about the Roman Empire, and there were centuries before that of mixed breeding and stuff like that. Whether we like to pretend that the Israelites followed the Old Testament, but we know they didn't. They repeatedly mixed in with the pagan cultures and stuff. So by the time of the Roman Empire, yes, genetically speaking, we know that there could be easily people with light brown hair and stuff like that. Now, Jesus, they were Jewish. They were Middle Eastern descent. They didn't have Caucasian white skin. We need to be, I don't want to support any white supremacy nor black supremacy. Jesus wasn't black either. He was Middle Eastern. Okay. So we just got to be real. But that doesn't mean that, he had to have black hair or dark hair. No, genetically speaking, it is possible. And what I found remarkable, I didn't know about until I studied this for our class there, is that the only known hair sample we have from the first century in Judea actually proves that Jews had red hair, Irish red hair. And that was a shock to me. So it's just ironic that the only hair we have preserved from the first century, the guy was a redhead. We had a Jewish redhead. So yeah, you can't make those easy assumptions, I don't think.
So the redheads that are hearing this are very happy right now.
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Yeah.
part of history somehow.
There
So,
you go.
concerning Jesus's characteristics, is there anything more that you think we need to add on that we're missing?
His characteristics.
So we say potential from the shroud, the hair appear straight.
Yep.
So we're saying that Jesus would have had straight hair.
Okay.
Do you agree, or is that what you're saying?
So it depends, right? So some people, it depends on a certain factor. So in some cases, the reason why it's so straight, some people think is because he was wearing a chin band that kind of made the hair go flat down.
Mhm.
And he clearly has a ponytail that's in the back. Now, with the ponytail, it does look a little unnatural at times, right? And what some scholars have said is with the Sudarium of Oviedo, so this is the purported head cloth that Jesus put on it's separate from the shroud. They put it on his head as they carried him from the cross to the tomb. And in order to put that on, they know exactly how they put that on the man. So they had to put it on, fold it around, and then it looks like they pinned it into the back of the guy's ponytail, sticking it in place. And by the time they got to the tomb and took off the sudarium, the blood had encrusted the hair stiff into place. And that's why the ponytail stiff into place even after they take off the thing and the sides of the hair. So that's one explanation for that. Yeah.
Yeah, Dale, that's very interesting. I think people would be intrigued to have a further discussion with you on this kind of topic. And I never got to introduce you as your podcast channel, The Real Seeker.
Yeah.
The Real Seeker.
Real Seeker is with an S on YouTube. And then on my blog is Real Seeker Singular Ministries.wordpress.com. I wish I didn't. I wish it was consistent. I should have done that, but
Well, that's good. At least the audience could find you by that route. So just a couple more questions.
absolutely.
The headscarf. You had told me that they had actually found that headscarf in another location from the shroud.
Yes, exactly. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. So it's currently held in a place called Oviedo in Spain.
Mhm.
And it's been in Spain since, and it has a fully known history. Everyone agrees with that. It's been in Spain since 711 AD. Before that, we can trace it traveling through Africa all the way back to Jerusalem. And it's never been in Europe or that sort of thing like the Shroud. And it dates back at the very latest. We have a historical mention of it in the 5th century AD, speaking of it as the sudarium that was on Jesus's head being, kept in a monastery, a cave monastery of St. Mark or something like that in Jerusalem. Now, the interesting thing here is that we can forensically link and anatomically link that sudarium cloth as having covered the same bloodied corpse that the shroud covered.
Wow.
And yeah, and in that way we can link them and date them back to the location of Jerusalem specifically and to the 5th century AD at the latest. Now, I'll mention something I didn't mention in the Bible study that I'll be mentioning in part 2. But there have also been limestone dust and pollen studies on both of these cloths. And in terms of dating, I'll mention one finding by a peer-reviewed. Marcia Boy is a world's expert in studying pollen grains and stuff like that. And they've discovered embedded in one of the blood stains on the sudarium, a pollen grain that can be linked to Jerusalem and is actually associated with ancient funeral rituals that went extinct during the Great Crisis of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century.
Okay.
They stopped being used after the 200s AD. So and it's embedded in the bloodstains. So we know that this grain got on there at the original time the bloodstains went onto the cloth. So that means we can actually push the sudarium back to at least 200 AD or earlier. And since it's been forensically linked to the shroud, that means the shroud dates to 200 AD or earlier.
Mhm.
So that's an incredible finding.
You know, when I think of the shroud and them keeping these items, the linen cloth and the head wrapping. So Jesus resurrects. That's the main feature while Jesus is alive. Why would they want to hold on to these linen cloths and this head wrapping? What would be the significance of that? Jesus is resurrected. That's what we care about.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and look, we just to some extent we're just speculating. I can't put myself back into the heads of the disciples, but the best educated guess I would have is that I think they kept it for proof to say, look, here are the guy's empty grave clothes. He resurrected from the dead. It's meant as proof, and there is some plausibility to this because there has been some biblical scholars and shroud experts. Granted, it's a minority view, but there has been some experts arguing that the shroud was actually shown, such as in to the Galatians in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. It's argued that they saw Jesus Christ publicly portrayed as crucified. None of these guys were in Jerusalem in 30 AD. They didn't see the real crucifixion. So what else could they be seeing? And we argue, well, maybe Paul or somebody else from Jerusalem was showing them the shroud images as miraculous proof. Like, here's proof he rose from the dead. He left the cloth and he left these supernatural images proving he was crucified. So,
Yeah, that would make sense, right?
I think
People are doubting the resurrection of Jesus. They are questioning with these different theories. And here's the shroud. Here's what he was in. He's not here anymore.
Yeah. I think that's the best explanation. It makes the most sense, kind of thing.
Okay.
Awesome.
Now, if we were to sum up the proof for the shroud in a couple points, what would you say is the major points for the shroud?
Okay. So I think so. It depends on what you mean by points, but I guess
Point to say what are the proofs? What if you were to talk to a person within 5 minutes, what would be the most significant things that you would say to say the shroud, this is the shroud of Jesus, and his resurrection is true?
Okay. Yeah. So I think I would say that the shroud images can be historically linked to Jesus Christ of the Gospels. And we have various proofs and evidences for this. But what's most important, these images have been studied scientifically by some of the world's most famous scientists in the world that are even non-Christian, including non-Christians, who've proven that these images had to have been formed miraculously, what looks to be at the moment of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And I think that would kind of hook them in if I had like 2 sentences to hook them in, and then they'll say, well, give me details. What are you talking about? So, yeah.
And then you would show them this podcast and make them watch it.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. I would say you've got to see Reverend Sule. He has such insightful questions. Yeah, you'll be a shroud expert by the end. So.
Well, Dale, I thank you for explaining the shroud. I want to have you back on. Maybe there's information that we could expand on concerning the shroud that we potentially missed. But I would encourage everybody who's watching to go to The Real Seekers on YouTube. And what is your blog?
The blog is realseekerministries.wordpress.com. And that's where I post up blogs with like sources to, the topics that I'm doing. So if you want to research beyond just the talking points that I'm giving, like I give the papers pro and con, and you can research that for yourself. And another thing I'll just plug, since it's the shroud, but on my Real Seekers with an S on YouTube, I have this playlist called Shroud Wars, which is all about the shroud, but it brings on the experts to actually get into those details and debate it from the people that are actually the primary researchers. So, yeah.
Dale, it's a pleasure to have you. Looking forward to having you again.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure talking with you too.
Okay, bless. Thank you for watching this video. If you like what you just watched, click the subscribe button. And beside that is a bell icon. Click that. It will notify you of all upcoming videos. Also, if you like this video, click the like button. But if you don't like what you just watched, you don't agree, that's okay. Go into the comments, leave a comment. Let's dialogue and talk. Thank you.